In the autumn of 2022, the soil of Haskell County was a quiet testament to a long and punishing thirst. The harvest was over, a frantic and dusty affair that had yielded more disappointment than profit. Now the fields lay naked and exposed under a vast, indifferent sky, the stubble of corn and soybeans brittle as old bow. The ground itself was the color of tired cement, cross-hatched with a fine web of desiccation cracks that ran from fence line to fence line. It was a landscape of held breath, waiting for a rain that the almanac promised, but the clouds refused to deliver. Arthur Pearsall stood on the edge of his West 80, a field that bore the deepest scars of the drought. He was 78 years old, a man shaped by the very land he stood upon. His face was a map of sun and wind, his hands thick and calloused, the knuckles swollen from a lifetime of work. He wore a faded denim shirt, the cuffs frayed, and worn dungarees held up by suspenders. His movements were slow, deliberate, born not of weakness but of a profound economy of motion. He wasted nothing. Not a step, not a word, not a drop of fuel. This particular field, the West 80, was his problem child. It had been for a decade. The yields had been slipping, season by season, in a slow, undeniable decline. The corn came up stunted, its leaves a pale, worried green. The soybeans struggled to form a canopy, leaving the soil beneath to bake and crust in the July sun. The agronomists he had spoken to over the years offered a litany of modern solutions: variable rate fertilization, new seed hybrids genetically engineered for drought tolerance, more potent herbicides. He had tried some, in measured doses, but the land did not respond. It was as if it had grown deaf to their chemical promises. The community had long since formed its opinion of Arthur Pearsall. At the grain elevator, in the booths of the corner diner, at the monthly co-op meetings, he was a subject of quiet, almost affectionate pity. He was a relic, they said. A good man, a hard worker from a bygone era, but hopelessly stuck in the past. He still ran a Minneapolis Moline G706, a tractor built in 1969, its orange paint faded to a pale persimmon. His combine was a Massey Ferguson from the Reagan administration, while his neighbors commanded fleets of colossal green and red machines guided by satellites, their cabs as quiet and clean as a hospital room. Arthur rumbled across his fields in open air, covered in a fine layer of the very soil he was tilling. He was seen as a man falling behind, a living photograph from a history book. The problem with the West 80 was not on the surface. It was deeper, a secret the soil kept 12 to 14 inches below the topsoil. It was a hard pan, a dense, almost impermeable layer of compacted clay and silt, forged over decades by the immense weight of modern machinery. His father had warned him about it. "Every pass with a heavy machine," his father had said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, "is a hammer blow. You can't see the anvil, but it's down there, and one day you'll find you've pounded the earth into a dish." The dish was now full. When the spring rains came, they would sit on the surface of the West 80, forming vast, shallow lakes that took days to evaporate, suffocating the young roots. In the summer, that same impenetrable layer would block those roots from reaching the deep subsoil moisture, leaving the crops to wither as if planted in a shallow tray. It was a paradox of drowning and thirst, all created by the very tools meant to ensure abundance. The other farmers in Haskell County had the same problem, but their solution was to throw more money at it. Bigger tractors, more aggressive tillage tools, and ever more expensive inputs to compensate for the failing soil structure. They were fighting a war of attrition against their own land. Arthur bent down, his knees cracking softly. He picked up a clump of dry earth. It crumbled in his palm into a fine grey powder. There was no life in it, no aggregation, no dark, loamy scent of humus. It was just mineral, the raw, inert material of the planet. He had walked this field thousands of times. He knew its contours not by a GPS map, but by the feel of the ground through the soles of his boots. He knew the spot where the soil was a little sandier, the low swale that held water an extra day, the rise where the clay was thickest. He had a relationship with this piece of ground that was more intimate than many of his human acquaintances. This year the bank had sent a letter, a polite, clinical inquiry about his declining yields, and a reminder of the collateral value of his land. It was the first such letter he had ever received. Arthur Pearsall had never owed any man $1 he could not pay. He owned his land, his house, his machinery. The Pearsall farm had been debt-free since 1958. The letter felt like a violation, an intrusion of a world he had deliberately kept at arm's length. It was a signal that his quiet, self-reliant existence was under threat. The problem of the West 80 was no longer a matter of agricultural frustration. It was becoming a matter of survival. He knew he had to act. But his action would not involve a trip to the bank for a loan or to the implement dealer for a new machine. It would involve a journey back into the deep, quiet wisdom of his own past. A week later, a gleaming white Ford F-150 with a John Deere logo emblazoned on its door pulled into Arthur's gravel driveway. A young man in his late 20s stepped out. He was crisp, clean, and confident. He wore a green polo shirt tucked into pressed khaki pants and carried a tablet computer in a ruggedized case. His name was Travis Miller, and he was the top sales consultant for the regional dealership. "Mr. Pearsall," he began, extending a hand. His handshake was firm, practiced. "Travis Miller. We spoke on the phone. Appreciate you giving me a few minutes." Arthur nodded, wiping his own hand on his trousers before shaking Travis's. "Arthur," he said. His voice was gravelly, used sparingly. "Great. So, you mentioned on the phone you were having some issues with soil compaction. It's the story of the year, I tell you. Everyone's fighting it." Travis gestured expansively at the West 80. "That your problem field?" "It is," Arthur said. Travis tapped on his tablet. "Okay, let's see. I pulled up your soil maps from the county survey. Looks like you're sitting on a lot of Harney silt loam. Good dirt, but it loves to pack down, especially with the high clay content in the subsoil. What have you been hitting it with?" Arthur did not answer immediately. He looked at the young man, at the glowing screen in his hands, at the sterile confidence in his eyes. He represented a world that ran on data points and quarterly reports, a world that believed every problem had a purchasable solution. "Tried a chisel plow, a disc ripper. Didn't touch it." Right, standard stuff," Travis said with a dismissive wave. "You're just scratching the surface with that. What you've got down there is a plow pan, a hard pan layer that's probably been building for 30, 40 years. It's like concrete. Your roots can't punch through and water can't drain. Am I right?" He said it as if he were revealing a great mystery. "You're right," Arthur said, his tone flat. "The solution," Travis announced, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a sales pitch, "is brute force. You have to go deeper and you have to shatter it. Completely obliterate that restrictive layer and reset the soil profile. We have the tool that can do it. The John Deere 2720 disc ripper. It's an absolute beast. We can configure it with 7 shanks, get you down to 20 inches, and behind it we've got hydraulic disc gangs that will leave you a perfect seed bed. You hook that up to a 9 Series tractor, something with at least 500 horsepower, and you can pull that thing at 5-6 miles an hour. Obliterate it." He swiped on his tablet and showed Arthur a video. A monstrous green tractor with 4 massive tracks pulled an equally monstrous implement through a field, throwing up huge clods of earth. The video was shot with drones, set to dramatic music. It looked like an army invading a country. "What does a tractor like that weigh?" Arthur asked, his eyes on the video. Travis beamed. "The 9RX. You're looking at over 40,000 pounds, All that weight means traction. It means putting the power to the ground. Arthur was silent. He was thinking of his father's words. A hammer blow. 40,000 pounds was not a hammer. It was a wrecking ball. Now, a new setup like that is an investment, no doubt. Travis continued, misinterpreting the silence as sticker shock. But we've got financing programs, leasing options. When you pencil out the yield increase, you're going to see it pays for itself. What are you getting on that field now? 150, 160 bushels on a good year? Less, Arthur admitted. I can practically guarantee you'll be back over 200, maybe 220 your first year after you run the 2,720 through there. The math is simple. He held out the tablet as if it were a sacred text. The screen showed spreadsheets, amortization tables, projected returns on investment. Arthur looked past the tablet, toward his main barn. The big doors were slightly ajar. In the shadows within, a piece of old iron sat in a thin veil of dust. I have a tool, Arthur said quietly. Travis's smile tightened. He was a professional. He knew how to handle the old ways objection. I'm sure you do, Mr. Pearsall, and I'm sure it was a fine tool in its day. But technology has moved on. The metallurgy, the design, the sheer horsepower we can apply now, it's a different world. Come look, Arthur said. It was not a request. He led the way to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of old oil, dry hay, and earth. Arthur slid the heavy door open farther, letting a wide shaft of afternoon light fall across the floor. There it sat. It was a single-shank subsoiler, but it looked like nothing Travis had ever seen in a catalogue. It was built on the heavy frame of what looked like an old Oliver moldboard plow, but the moldboard was gone. In its place was a single, enormous shank, nearly 4 feet long. It was not straight, but curved in a gentle, parabolic arc. The point was long and narrow, like a spearhead, and welded to the back of the shank, about a foot up from the point, were 2 angled wings, like the fins of a bomb. The whole thing was painted a faded red, with rust showing at the welds. It was monstrous, ancient, and to Travis's eyes utterly absurd. Travis Miller let out a short, involuntary laugh. He tried to stifle it, but it came out as a puff of amused air. Wow, he said, walking around it. That is something else. What is it? My father built it, Arthur said. Back in the 60s, we call it a deep shank. And you think this thing is going to break up a modern hardpan? Travis asked, his professional courtesy evaporating in the face of such rustic folly. Mr. Pearsall, with all due respect, this is a museum piece. You don't have a tractor that could even pull this thing deep enough to do any good, and even if you did, the design is all wrong. There's no shattering effect, no rolling basket to break up clods. It's just a big piece of steel. Arthur ran his hand along the curved shank. The steel was cool and smooth. He felt the faint, almost imperceptible undulations left by the forge hammer his father had used. The design is correct, he said. Travis shook his head, a look of pity now on his face. He saw a stubborn old man, clinging to a piece of scrap iron and a fading memory. He was wasting his time. Look, Mr. Pearsall, I'll tell you what, I'll leave my card. When you're ready to talk about a real solution, give me a call. We can have a new ripper out here in a week. But that thing, he gestured at the plow, that thing belongs on a pedestal at the county fair, not in a field. He turned and walked back to his gleaming truck, his footsteps crisp on the gravel. He did not look back. Arthur stood in the doorway of the barn, the light at his back, watching him go. He was not angry. He was not offended. He felt a quiet, profound sense of solitude. The young man had looked at the plow, but he had not seen it. He had seen old metal and rust. He had not seen the principle. The encounter with the salesman was followed by the more casual but no less pointed skepticism of his neighbors. The hub of local opinion was the corner diner, a place where coffee was 50 cents and the news traveled faster than the internet. Arthur was a regular, though he usually sat alone at the counter nursing a single cup. A few days after Travis Miller's visit, Arthur overheard his name from a booth behind him. It was Richard Sterling and a couple of other farmers. Sterling was the biggest operator in the county, a man who farmed thousands of acres with the newest and biggest equipment money could buy. His farm was a showcase of modern agricultural power. "Saw the John Deere kid leaving old Arthur's place the other day," one man said. "Trying to sell him a new tractor, I bet." Sterling chuckled. It was a rich, confident sound. "He's got a better chance of selling a spaceship. Arthur's still convinced that old Moline of his is the peak of engineering. Did you see him out there during harvest? Looked like a parade float." There was general laughter. "It's a shame, though." Another voice chimed in. "That West 80 of his is just about shot. The hardpan's so bad the water just sits there. He's losing 20,000–30,000 a year on that field alone." "I know," Sterling said. "I told him, 'Arthur, just let me come in with my big ripper. I'll do it for you for the cost of fuel. We'll tear that pan to kingdom come.' You know what he said?" Sterling paused for dramatic effect. "The ground doesn't want to be torn." More laughter. The men in the booth clearly found this hilarious. "The ground doesn't want to be torn. What the hell does that mean?" "It means he's lost it," Sterling said, his voice lowering slightly, as if sharing a sad diagnosis. "He's a good old boy, but he's living in the past. He's got some homemade plow in his barn he thinks is a magic wand. He's going to go broke trying to prove a point that nobody's arguing anymore." Arthur continued to stare into his coffee cup. The ceramic was thick, the coffee black. He heard every word. They were not being cruel, not intentionally. In their world, the world of spreadsheets and horsepower and economies of scale, he was a fool. His refusal to accept their help, their logic, was an affront to their entire way of life. It was incomprehensible. They pitied him because it was the only way they could make sense of him. He paid for his coffee with 2 quarters he left on the counter and walked out. The air outside was crisp, the sky a deep, cloudless blue. He did not feel foolish. He did not feel angry. He felt a quiet resolve hardening within him. They saw an old man and an old plow. They saw rust and stubbornness. They did not see the 40 years of observation. They did not see the memory of a father's hands. They did not see the subtle curve of the steel, and they did not understand the ground. They stood on it, drove over it, took from it, but they did not understand it. He did, and he would prove it. Not for them, for the land. That evening, Arthur did not turn on the television. He sat in his father's old armchair, the floral pattern worn smooth over the decades. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a mantel clock. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back, not just years, but an entire lifetime. He was a young man again, walking the West 80 with his father, Elias Pearsall. It was the late 1960s. The farm was smaller then, and the machines, by today's standards, were toys. But the trend had already begun. Tractors were getting heavier. The neighbors were buying bigger discs, bigger plows. Elias Pearsall, a man as quiet and solid as an oak tree, was watching with a skeptical eye. "They're in a hurry," Elias had said one afternoon, stopping to watch a neighbor's new International tractor churn across an adjacent field. The machine was powerful, loud, and fast. "They think speed is the same as progress." Arthur, then in his early 20s, and full of the impatience of youth, had been impressed by the neighbor's machine. "He'll be done with his fall tillage in 3 days, Dad. It takes us 2 weeks. His father had bent down and crumbled a piece of soil in his hand, just as Arthur had done himself so many years later. "We're not making widgets in a factory, son," Elias said. "We're in a partnership. And our partner, the soil, doesn't like to be rushed. It doesn't like to be shouted at, and it sure as hell doesn't like to be beaten. He pointed at the tracks left by the big International. You see that? That's a signature. Every time that machine crosses this field, it signs its name, and its name is weight. That weight goes down, and it presses. It squeezes the air out. It squeezes the life out. Down deep, where you can't see, it's building a floor. A second floor, right under your topsoil. This was the moment the idea was planted in Arthur's mind, the concept of the double floor, the hard pan. His father had seen it coming decades before the agronomists gave it a name and sold machines to fight it. So what do we do? Young Arthur had asked. We don't make the floor in the first place. Elias had answered. We stay light, we stay patient, but the floor is already there on some of this ground we bought, from the old tractors, the heavy combines, so we have to deal with it. But you don't fight the hard pan, you persuade it. Persuade it? Arthur had been confused. It's dirt, Dad. No, Elias had said, his voice firm. It's a system. It's alive. When you shatter it, like they want to do, you're just breaking it into chunks. The water will find the cracks, sure, but the chunks themselves are still dead and dense, and then you drive your big heavy tractor over it again, and you press those chunks right back together. You haven't solved the problem. You've just stirred it up. This was the core principle, the central thesis that had been lost to the modern world of brute force. You don't shatter the hard pan, you lift it. The hard pan is tense. Elias had explained, holding his hands flat, one a few inches below the other. It's a layer under pressure. If you can get under it and lift it just an inch or two, it will break itself. It will fracture upwards along its own lines of weakness. It will crack like a sheet of ice when you press up from below. You're not destroying the structure. You're releasing the tension. You're letting it breathe. The memory was so vivid Arthur could almost smell the damp earth of that long-ago afternoon. He could see his father's earnest face, the dirt under his fingernails, the passion in his eyes. This was not folklore. It was physics. It was engineering. It was a deep, intuitive understanding of soil mechanics. The idea led them to the barn, to the pile of scrap iron and old implements that every farmer keeps. Elias had sketched it out on the dusty floor with a piece of chalk. A single, deep shank. It had to be strong enough not to break, but narrow enough to slice through the soil with minimal disturbance. It needed a sharp, hardened point to penetrate the pan, and it needed a curve. It can't be straight, Elias had insisted, erasing his chalk line and drawing a new one, a graceful arc. A straight shank is a battering ram. It pushes forward. It compacts the soil in front of it. It creates its own little hard pan just ahead of the tip. It has to be curved. A curve slices and lifts. It guides the soil upwards. And then came the final crucial element, the wings. Once we're under the pan, Elias had drawn two small angled lines on the back of his curved shank. We need to lift a wide path, not just the width of the shank, so we add wings, little mold boards, but they don't turn the soil over. They just lift it. Gently. They create a wave, a swell that travels up through the hard pan layer. That's what creates the fractures. They had spent that entire winter building it. They started with the heavy-duty frame of a 3-bottom Oliver Plow they bought at an auction for $10. They removed the mold boards and braces, leaving only the main beam and the hitch. The shank itself was the masterwork. Elias had sourced a massive leaf spring from a semi-truck. It already had a slight curve. In their small forge they heated it, hammered it, shaped it, sharpening the leading edge and drawing the point out. It was brutal, exhausting work. The ring of hammer on steel echoed in the cold winter air. Arthur remembered his own role. He was the striker, swinging the heavy sledgehammer while his father held the hot steel with tongs, turning it, guiding the blows. His arms had ached for weeks. When the shank was shaped, they had welded the lifting wings on, carefully setting them at what his father judged to be the perfect angle, about 20 degrees from horizontal. Then came the hardening. They heated the point and the leading edge to a cherry red, and quenched it in a barrel of used motor oil. The hiss and plume of black smoke was a mark of transformation. The steel was now hard enough to cut through rock. The final piece of the puzzle was not in the plow itself, but in the knowledge of how to use it. This knowledge his father had recorded in a small, black, oil-stained notebook. Arthur got up from his chair and went to the roll-top desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, he retrieved the notebook. The cover was soft and worn. The pages were filled with his father's neat, methodical script. It was a logbook, a journal, a scientific treatise. There were dates, field names, and weather conditions. And there were the rules. Rule 1. Timing is everything. The soil must not be wet. It must not be dry. It must be plastic. He had underlined the word plastic. When you can form a ball of soil in your hand, and it holds its shape but doesn't feel sticky, that is the time. If it's too wet, the shank will just make a muddy slot. If it's too dry, the pan will shatter into clods, not fracture. You are looking for the moment of perfect friability. Rule 2. Depth is critical. You must be below the pan, not in it. Not at it. Below it. Find the bottom of the pan with a probe rod. Set the shank 2 inches deeper. The notebook had detailed drawings of how to build a probe rod from a piece of solid steel, and how to feel for the change in resistance that marked the bottom of the hard pan. Rule 3. Speed is the enemy. Go slow. First gear. Let the plow do the work. You are not ripping. You are lifting. The tractor should be pulling steadily, not straining. If you are spinning the tires, you are going too fast or your depth is wrong. Listen to the engine. It will tell you. Rule 4. Weight is the problem, not the solution. Use the lightest tractor that can do the job. The Moline is enough. Its weight is distributed over 4 large tires. It floats more than it presses. A heavy tractor will compact the soil you have just loosened. Arthur closed the notebook. It was all there, a complete system, born of observation, refined by trial and error, and proven over time. The men at the diner, the salesman with his tablet, they saw an old plow. They did not see the theory behind it. They saw a relic, not a precision instrument designed for a specific task. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the West 80. The moon was rising, casting a pale, sterile light on the cracked ground. Tomorrow, he would begin. He would follow the rule. He would honor the knowledge. The time for waiting was over. The time for quiet, methodical action had arrived. The next morning, Arthur woke before the sun. The air was cold and still. He did not need an alarm clock. His internal one was set to the rhythms of the farm. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he pulled on his work boots and headed not to the field, but to the machine shed. The Minneapolis Moline G706 sat in its usual spot, a hulking orange presence in the dim light. To a modern eye, it was an antique. The tires were narrow, the engine exposed, the operator's platform open to the elements. There was no GPS globe, no computer screen, no air conditioning. There was a seat, a steering wheel, and a series of heavy steel levers. But Arthur saw something else. He saw a machine that was honest. Every part was accessible. Every function was mechanical, direct. He could fix nearly anything on it with a set of wrenches and a clear head. He began his ritual of preparation. It was a slow, deliberate process that he never rushed. He opened the petcock on the bottom of the fuel tank, draining a small amount into a glass jar to check for water. The diesel was clean and bright. He unscrewed the large cap on the radiator and looked inside. The coolant was green and up to the neck. He pulled the engine oil dipstick, wiped it on a clean rag, reinserted it, and checked the level. Perfect. The oil was dark, but he had changed it just 50 hours ago. It was good. Next, he moved to the air filter. He unclipped the large canister and removed the outer element, tapping it gently on the concrete floor. A small cloud of dust fell out. He held it up to the light, inspecting it for tears. It was sound. He did the same with the inner element. Then he reassembled the canister, making sure the seals were seated correctly. An engine breathed, just like a man, and clean air was life. He checked the hydraulic fluid, the transmission oil. He walked around the entire tractor, a grease gun in his hand, systematically injecting fresh grease into every zerk fitting, the steering knuckles, the three-point hitch pivots, the axle bearings. Each pump of the handle was a small act of preservation, a pushback against friction and wear. His neighbors paid dealerships thousands of dollars for service contracts. Arthur performed his own service with a $20 grease gun and a half-century of experience. Finally, he checked the tires. He used a pressure gauge, kneeling by each one. They were slightly low. He dragged the air hose from the compressor in the corner and brought each tire up to the precise pressure specified in the old operator's manual. 18 pounds per square inch for the rears, 22 for the fronts. This was crucial. The right pressure allowed the tires to flex, to spread their footprint, distributing the tractor's 12,000-pound weight over a larger area. It was the first step in respecting his father's rule about weight. With the tractor ready, he turned his attention to the plow. He hooked a chain to it and dragged it out of the barn into the daylight. He spent an hour with a wire brush and a scraper, cleaning off the accumulated dust and flakes of rust. He inspected every weld, looking for cracks. The welds his father had laid down were thick and strong, as solid as the day they were made. He took a file and sharpened the leading edge of the spear-like point, restoring its edge. The plow was not just a blunt instrument, it was a cutting tool. Hitching the plow to the tractor was a physical task. The G706 had a Category 2 3-point hitch, a design that had become standard, but it required lining things up by eye and muscle. He backed the tractor up, getting the two lift arms close to the plow's hitch pins. He shut off the engine, dismounted, and used a heavy steel pry bar to lever the massive plow into perfect alignment. He slid the lift arms onto the pins and secured them with linchpins. Then he attached the top link, adjusting its length so the plow sat level. He stood back and looked at the union of tractor and plow, the faded orange and the faded red. They looked like they belonged together. Two pieces of old iron, dismissed by the modern world, ready for a task no one believed they could accomplish. But he did not head to the field yet. He picked up the steel probe rod his father had made, a 5-foot length of half-inch steel with a handle welded on top and a sharp point on the bottom, and walked out to the west 80. It was time to obey Rule 1. Timing is everything. He spent the next 2 days walking the field. He did not walk in a straight line. He meandered, following some internal map. Every 50 paces or so he would stop. He would drive the probe rod into the ground. He would use his body weight, pushing down, feeling the resistance. The topsoil was soft, easy. Then, at about a foot deep, the resistance would increase dramatically. This was the top of the hardpan. He would push harder, feeling the steel rod grind against the dense, compacted layer. Then, with more effort, the rod would suddenly plunge deeper. He had broken through. That was the bottom of the pan. He pulled the rod out and measured the depth of the pan with a tape measure. 4 inches thick here, 5 inches there. In some places, it was a dense 6-inch slab of compressed earth. He was not just mapping its thickness, he was feeling its texture. After probing, he would use a small hand auger to pull up a soil sample from just below the surface. He would take the soil in his palm and squeeze it. The first day, it was too dry. It crumbled into dust. It would not form a ball. If it's too dry, the pan will shatter into clods, not fracture. So he waited. The forecast called for a small chance of rain, but it never came. The waiting gnawed at him. The season was advancing. Winter was not far off. But his father's rules were not suggestions. They were laws. He had to trust the process. On the morning of the third day there was a heavy dew. The air felt different, laden with a moisture you could feel on your skin. He walked out to the field again. He augured a sample. He squeezed it in his fist. He opened his hand. This time the soil held its shape. A perfect, rough ball. He poked it with his finger. It crumbled easily without smearing. It was not sticky. It was plastic. Friable. It was time. He walked back to the shed, his step now quick and purposeful. He fired up the Moline. The big 6-cylinder diesel engine caught with a puff of black smoke, and then settled into a low, throbbing idle. The sound was a deep, mechanical heartbeat. He climbed into the seat, the cold steel a familiar shock. He engaged the PTO to get the hydraulic pump running, then raised the big red plow off the ground. He drove slowly out of the yard and down the lane to the West 80. He passed Richard Sterling's farm on the way. Sterling was out, in his yard, talking to a seed dealer. He saw Arthur on his ancient tractor with the bizarre-looking plow. Sterling stopped his conversation, shook his head slowly, and made a comment to the dealer. Both men smiled with an air of condescending amusement. Arthur looked straight ahead and kept driving. He reached the edge of the field and stopped. He got off the tractor one more time. He used the probe rod again, right at his starting point. He found the bottom of the hardpan at 16 inches. He went back to the tractor and adjusted the top link of the 3-point hitch, tilting the plow slightly forward. Then he adjusted the draft control lever. He was setting the depth. He wanted the point of the plow to be running at 18 inches, 2 inches below the pan. Rule 2. Depth is critical. He climbed back into the seat. He took a deep breath. He looked out across the 80 acres of cracked, tired earth. It was a daunting task. It would take days. He put the tractor in its lowest gear. He eased the throttle forward until the engine was running at about 1,800 revolutions per minute, the sweet spot where it produced maximum torque. He took hold of the hydraulic lever. Slowly, carefully, he lowered the plow. The massive red shank met the ground. The point bit in, slicing through the dry topsoil. The plow sank deeper and deeper. 10 inches, 12, 14. Then it hit the hard pan. The sound of the tractor changed immediately. The engine's steady thrum deepened into a guttural groan. The rear wheels, despite the dry condition, began to slip slightly. The whole tractor shuddered. This was the moment of truth. Would the old Moline have the power? Would the plow hold together? The point of the plow was grinding against the concrete-like layer. For a moment, it seemed like Sterling and the men at the diner were right. The tractor was stopping. But Arthur did not panic. He knew his machine, he knew the plow, he kept the throttle steady. He waited. Then, with a deep, resonant thump that he felt through the steel seat and the soles of his boots, the hardened point broke through the bottom of the hardpan. The tractor surged forward a few feet. The engine's groan eased slightly. He was in. He was under the floor. He began to drive. The pace was agonizingly slow. A walking pace, maybe 1.5 miles per hour. Rule 3. Speed is the enemy. Behind the tractor, the earth was not being thrown or turned over as it would be with a moldboard plow or a chisel. Something else was happening. Something subtle and strange. The single shank cut a narrow slot in the ground, but on either side of that slot, for about 3 feet in each direction, the surface of the ground was visibly, gently lifting. It was a swell, a wave of earth, rising perhaps 4 or 5 inches before settling back down, but it did not settle back into its old position. It settled back soft, full of cracks. He could see the fine web of fractures appearing on the surface as the ground swelled and relaxed. This was the principle in action. The curved shank was slicing forward. The spear point was running deep in the softer subsoil below the pan, and the angled wings, the crucial element, were lifting the entire 6-foot-wide slab of hardpan above them. The pan was not being shattered by impact, it was being bent, and as it bent, its own internal tension was causing it to fracture from the bottom up. It was cracking like a pane of glass with pressure applied to its center. He was not fighting it. He was persuading it. He drove the first pass, a dead, straight line down the half-mile length of the field. The sound of the engine was his guide. He listened to its pitch, its labor. When the groan became too deep, he knew he was hitting a thicker or harder section of the pan. He did not try to force it. He just kept the forward pressure steady and let the plow do its work. At the far end of the field, he lifted the plow, turned the tractor around, and started back, leaving about 6 feet between his first pass and his second. He was creating a pattern of deep fractures across the entire field. It was methodical. It was repetitive. It was profoundly satisfying. He worked all day. The sun climbed, passed its zenith, and began its slow descent. He did not stop for lunch. He had a thermos of water and a sandwich he ate with one hand while the other stayed on the steering wheel. The world shrank to the orange hood of the tractor, the single red shank buried in the earth, and the sound of the straining diesel. From the road it was an odd sight. The slow, old tractor, making these seemingly superficial passes. Richard Sterling drove by in his climate-controlled pickup truck. He slowed, watched for a minute, and shook his head in disbelief. Arthur's work looked pointless. There were no big clods, no dramatic upheaval of soil. It looked like he was just scratching lines in the dirt. He couldn't see the deep, transformative work happening 18 inches below the surface. He couldn't see the fractures spreading through the hardpan like cracks in a windshield. All he saw was an old fool on an old tractor wasting his time. That evening at the diner, Sterling reported his observation. "I saw Arthur out there with his contraption," he told the usual crowd. "He's not even moving dirt. The ground behind the tractor looks almost the same as the ground in front of it. I've never seen anything so useless. It's sad, is what it is." The consensus in the booth was that Arthur was engaged in a kind of agricultural theatre, a performance for an audience of one. They didn't understand that the most important work is often invisible. Arthur worked for 5 straight days, from sunup to sundown. The G706 burned through its 45-gallon fuel tank once a day. Each evening he would refuel it from the bulk tank by his shed, then check the oil and coolant, and walk around the plow, inspecting it for stress. The old iron held. The welds were true. The point was wearing, as expected, but it was still sharp enough. On the 3rd day, his grandson Leo showed up. Leo was 20, home from college where he was studying business. He was a good kid, quiet and observant like Arthur, but he belonged to the new generation. He understood spreadsheets and marketing, not soil mechanics. He stood at the edge of the field for a long time, watching. Arthur saw him and stopped the tractor at the end of a pass. He shut off the engine. The sudden silence was immense. "Grandpa," Leo said, walking up, "what are you doing?" The question was genuine, not judgmental. "I'm fixing the field," Arthur said, his voice hoarse from the engine noise. Leo looked at the ground. He kicked at a piece of the lifted soil. It was still dry on the surface, but it was now loose, full of air. "The guys in town are saying you're wasting your time." "I know what they're saying," Arthur said. He got off the tractor, his legs stiff. He walked over to a spot he had just passed over. He knelt down and started digging with his bare hands. The topsoil was soft. He dug deeper and the soil remained loose. He was able to dig down a full 18 inches without a shovel. He pulled out a piece of what had been the hard pan. It was no longer a solid slab. It was a chunk of aggregated soil, riddled with fine cracks. It looked like a piece of stale bread. He crumbled it in his hand. This was the problem, Arthur said, showing the crumbled earth to Leo. It was a wall. Now it's a doorway. Leo looked from the soil in his grandfather's hand to the vast, untouched portion of the field, then back to the old tractor and its strange plow. He didn't fully understand the physics, but he understood the result in his grandfather's hand. He saw the logic. "How did you know how to do this?" "My father taught me," Arthur said simply. He listened to the ground. Most people don't do that anymore. Leo stayed for another hour, watching his grandfather start the tractor and make another slow, methodical pass. He saw the gentle swell of the earth, the quiet fracturing of the surface. He was beginning to see. By the end of the 5th day, the West 80 was done. Every square foot of it had been treated. The surface looked different now. It was not smooth and cracked anymore. It was slightly corrugated, covered in a pattern of shallow fissures. It looked like it had taken a deep, shuddering breath and relaxed. Arthur drove the Moline back to the shed. He was exhausted, every bone and muscle aching, but it was a good ache, the ache of work properly done. He had fulfilled his part of the partnership. Now it was up to the land and the sky. He did not have to wait long. 2 nights later, the weather changed. A front moved in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Arthur sat on his porch, watching the storm approach. He felt no anxiety, only a quiet anticipation. This would be the first test. The rain started just after dark, a few fat, sporadic drops. Then the sky opened up. It was not a gentle shower. It was a deluge, a classic Midwestern gully washer. Rain came down in solid, wind-driven sheets, the kind of rain that usually sent torrents of brown water sluicing off the field, carrying topsoil and expensive fertilizer with it into the ditches. The next morning, Arthur drove his old pickup truck around the county to survey the effects. The evidence was stark. On his neighbors' fields, including Richard Sterling's land adjacent to the West 80, the story was the same. Huge, shallow ponds of standing water mirrored the grey sky. In the low spots, the corn stubble was completely submerged. Water was running in muddy rivers down the tire tracks and drainage ways, heading for the county ditch. The land had taken what it could on the surface, and the rest, the vast majority, it had shed like a waterproof coat. Then he turned onto the road that ran alongside his own West 80. He stopped the truck and got out. The field was transformed. There was no standing water, not a single puddle. The entire surface was a uniform, dark chocolate brown. The 2 inches of rain that had fallen had not run off. It had soaked in every drop. The ground had drunk it up. The deep fractures he had created in the hardpan had acted as conduits, allowing the water to move down into the thirsty subsoil, recharging the profile. The field had not been a dish to be filled. It had become a sponge. From a distance, Richard Sterling saw it too. He was out in his own massive 4-wheel-drive truck, assessing the flooding on his own land. He drove up to the fence line that separated his property from Arthur's. He got out of his truck and just stood there, staring. On his side of the fence, a small lake was forming, the water creeping up the stalks of last year's corn. The soil was sealed, impermeable. 10 feet away, on Arthur's side of the fence, the ground was dark and perfectly drained. The contrast was not subtle. It was an absolute, damning indictment of one method and a stunning vindication of the other. Sterling walked along the fence, his expensive boots sinking into the mud of his own field. He looked back and forth, from his land to Arthur's, as if trying to comprehend a magic trick. He had more horsepower, more technology, more data than any farmer in the state. He had spent a fortune on inputs and iron, and his field was drowning while the old man's field, tilled with a homemade relic, had absorbed the storm perfectly. He was a man who lived by numbers and results, and the result in front of him was undeniable. It defied everything he thought he knew. He stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping at his jacket, a profound and unsettling silence falling over his usually confident mind. He was forced to confront a possibility he had never seriously entertained, that he, with all his capital and technology, was wrong, and that old Arthur Pearsall, the man he and everyone else had pitied, was right. The winter came, blanketing the fields in snow. The West 80 rested under its white blanket, the deep moisture locked in its profile. In the spring, when the snow melted, it did so without runoff. The water simply sank into the restored soil. The true test, however, would be the growing season. The talk at the diner had shifted. The dramatic difference in drainage after the autumn storm had quieted the outright mockery of Arthur, replacing it with a grudging curiosity. Sterling himself was uncharacteristically silent on the subject. He was watching. Everyone was watching. Arthur prepared for planting with his usual deliberation. He worked the West 80 once, very lightly, with a field cultivator to prepare the seedbed. The tractor seemed to pull the implement more easily than he remembered. The soil flowed around the shanks, dark and loamy. It had a different feel, a different smell. It smelled alive. He planted his corn in early May, using his old 6-row John Deere 7000 planter, a machine considered laughably small by modern standards. But the planter performed flawlessly, placing each seed at a precise depth in the moist, forgiving soil. On the other side of the fence, Richard Sterling was planting with a 48-row planter pulled by a 600-horsepower tractor, a machine so wide it had to be folded hydraulically for road transport. He was planting his fields in a fraction of the time, but machines were once again compacting the soil, even as they planted the seeds. The corn came up, and the difference was immediate. Arthur's corn emerged strong and uniform, the rows a vibrant electric green. Sterling's corn was patchier, and its color was a slightly paler shade. As the season progressed, the gap widened. By July, the height difference was obvious to anyone driving by. Arthur's corn was a foot taller, its stalks thicker, its leaves a deep, healthy, waxy green. Sterling's corn looked stressed. Its leaves were starting to curl at the edges during the heat of the day, a classic sign that the roots were struggling to find water. The hard pan, shattered but not removed, and recompacted by the heavy spring equipment, was still doing its work, preventing the roots from reaching the deep moisture. Arthur's corn, however, had sent its roots down through the fractured clay, down into the reservoir of moisture he had created with the autumn rain. It was thriving. He walked the field in the evenings, the tall stalks rustling around him. He could feel the health of the crop, the vibrant energy of it. The climax arrived in October, at harvest time. Arthur fired up his old Massey Ferguson combine. It was a modest machine with the 6-row corn head. It took him 4 days to harvest the West 80. Across the fence, Sterling's massive John Deere S780 combine, with its 16-row head, devoured his corn in a single afternoon. But speed was not the metric that mattered. The metric that mattered was yield. Inside the cab of his old combine, Arthur watched the simple digital yield monitor he had installed years ago. The numbers it was displaying were unlike any he had ever seen from this field. They hovered consistently in the 230s, the 240s, and in the best parts of the field, they touched 250 bushels per acre. He had to check the calibration twice, thinking the sensor was faulty. It was not. He finished the field and drove his grain truck to the co-op elevator in town. The scale ticket was the final, irrefutable proof. After calculating for moisture content, the final yield for the 80-acre field averaged out to 242 bushels per acre. It was not just a good yield. It was a phenomenal yield, the kind of yield farmers dream of. It was nearly 100 bushels per acre, more than he had gotten the previous year. 2 days later, Richard Sterling's trucks started rolling into the same elevator. The talk among the drivers was that his corn was a disappointment. His field adjacent to Arthur's, the one with the same soil type, planted with the latest high-tech hybrid, had yielded an average of 165 bushels per acre. The math was brutal and simple. On that 180-acre field, Arthur Pearsall had harvested 6,160 more bushels of corn than Richard Sterling would have. At the current market price of $6 per bushel, that was a difference of $36,960. It was more than the cost of a new pickup truck. It was more than the annual payment on a new tractor. And Arthur had achieved it not by spending more money, but by spending less. His fuel costs for tillage were a fraction of Sterling's. He had used no extra fertilizer. His only major investment was his own time, his own labor, and the knowledge stored in a faded notebook. The vindication was absolute. It was not a matter of opinion or philosophy. It was written on a scale ticket, quantifiable in bushels and in dollars. The quiet old man with the museum-piece plow had not just done better. He had blown the doors off the most technologically advanced farming operation in the county. The result was so stark, so undeniable, that it sent a shockwave through the local agricultural community. The story of Arthur's West 80 became the central topic of conversation at the diner, at the elevator, at the seed dealership. The tone was no longer pity or amusement. It was awe. A week after the harvest was complete, a familiar pickup truck, a late-model Ford F250 King Ranch, pulled into Arthur Pearsall's driveway. It was Richard Sterling. He did not get out immediately. He just sat in his truck for a long moment, looking at Arthur's modest, well-kept farmhouse. Finally, the door opened, and he stepped out. He was not the same man who had laughed about Arthur in the diner. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He was dressed in his work clothes, not his business meeting khakis. He walked up to the porch where Arthur was sitting, cleaning a piece of machinery. Arthur looked up. He nodded a simple greeting. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply waited. Sterling stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it over and over. "Arthur," he said, his voice quiet. "I came here to say two things. First, I was wrong." He paused, letting the words hang in the cool autumn air. It was a difficult admission for a man like him, a man whose entire identity was built on being right, on being the best. "I was wrong," he repeated, as if to convince himself as much as Arthur. "I laughed at you, I pitied you, and you were so far ahead of me I couldn't even see what you were doing." Arthur continued his work, wiping grease from a bearing with a clean rag. He let the silence stretch. "The second thing is," Sterling continued, looking up and meeting Arthur's eyes, "I need to understand. I don't get it. I have the best equipment, the best seed, the best chemical program. My agronomists have PhDs, and you beat me by almost 80 bushels an acre with a tractor from the 60s and a plow you built in a barn. How? I need to know how." This was the moment Arthur had been waiting for, though he hadn't known it. It was not a moment for triumph, but for teaching. He set down the bearing and the rag. "Come with me," he said. He led Sterling not to the field, but to the barn, the same barn where Travis Miller, the John Deere salesman, had laughed. Arthur slid the heavy door open. The afternoon sun illuminated the big red plow, which sat cleaned and oiled in the center of the floor. It no longer looked like a piece of junk. It looked like a sculpture, a monument to a forgotten idea. Sterling walked around it slowly, this time with a look of reverence, not ridicule. He ran his hand along the curved shank. He touched the sharp point. He examined the lifting wings. "I saw you pulling this," he said. It didn't look like it was doing anything. "The real work was invisible," Arthur said. He then began to explain. He did not use fancy terms. He used the simple, direct language his father had used. He talked about the double floor. He explained the difference between shattering and lifting. He picked up a shingle from a workbench to demonstrate. "You're big rippers," Arthur said, laying the shingle flat. "They come in, and they do this." He made a fist and punched the shingle, breaking it into several large, jagged pieces. "See? It's broken, but the pieces are still dense, and the next time you drive your 50,000-pound tractor over them—" He pressed down on the pieces with his palm. "You just press them back together. You might even make it worse. Now this plow," he continued, picking up another intact shingle. "It doesn't punch, it gets underneath." He slid his fingers under the shingle, and it lifts. He pressed up gently in the middle. The shingle bowed, and then, with a soft crack, a fracture appeared, running from end to end. It lets the ground break itself. It releases the tension. It doesn't fight. It persuades. Sterling stared at the fractured shingle in Arthur's hand. The simplicity and elegance of the concept struck him like a physical blow. All his horsepower, all his hydraulic force, was just a bigger hammer. Arthur had used a key. Arthur then went to his desk and retrieved his father's black notebook. He opened it and handed it to Sterling. "This is the how," he said. Sterling took the notebook with a reverence usually reserved for a holy text. He slowly turned the worn pages, looking at the neat script, the hand-drawn diagrams, the careful notes on soil moisture and tractor speed. He saw the rules. Timing is everything. Depth is critical. Speed is the enemy. Weight is the problem. It was a complete philosophy of soil stewardship, written in 50 pages. "My God," Sterling whispered. "It was all right here." He looked up at Arthur. "Your father? He figured this all out?" "He paid attention," Arthur said. "He believed the ground had something to say." Sterling stood there in the quiet of the barn for a long time, the notebook in his hands. The gulf between his approach and Arthur's was suddenly clear. He had been treating his farm like a factory, a substrate for chemical reactions and mechanical processes. Arthur was treating his like a living partner. The news of Sterling's visit and his subsequent change of heart spread almost as fast as the yield numbers had. A few weeks later, another pristine white pickup truck pulled into Arthur's drive. It was Travis Miller, the John Deere salesman. He looked much less confident than he had a year ago. "Mr. Pearsall," he said, walking up to Arthur, who was splitting firewood. I owe you an apology." Arthur stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block. "I laughed at your plow," Travis said, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I called it a museum piece. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. The whole dealership is talking about your West 80. My bosses are asking me how we missed it. How a guy with a 50-year-old tractor could get a yield we can't promise with $1 million worth of new iron." He gestured back toward the road. "I came to ask if you would be willing to explain it to me. Not as a salesman, just as someone who needs to learn." Arthur looked at the young man. He saw not a slick salesman anymore, but a student who had been humbled by a lesson he didn't know he was being taught. He nodded toward the barn. "The explanation is in there," he said. Arthur spent the next hour walking Travis through the same principles he had shown Sterling. He explained the lifting action, the importance of timing, the problem of compaction. Travis didn't take out his tablet. He took out a small paper notebook and a pen, and he wrote down everything Arthur said. "We don't make anything like this," Travis said, looking at the red plow. "Nothing in our entire product line is based on this principle. It's all about speed and shattering." "Speed is the enemy," Arthur quoted his father. "We have to change that," Travis said, more to himself than to Arthur. This is a game changer." Travis went back to his dealership and gave a full report to his managers. He championed Arthur's method. At first, the corporate engineers were skeptical, but the yield data was irrefutable. A team of engineers from the John Deere factory in Iowa eventually flew out to Haskell County. They came to Arthur's farm, not to sell him anything, but to study his plow. They took measurements. They took soil samples from his field and from Sterling's. They scanned the plow with 3D imaging equipment. They confirmed everything his father had known intuitively. The parabolic curve of the shank minimized drag and soil disturbance. The angle of the lifting wings was optimized for creating a hydraulic wave effect in the specific silt-loam soil of the region. The slow speed was essential for allowing the fractures to propagate fully. Arthur Pearsall's homemade plow was not a crude relic. It was a highly sophisticated, site-specific piece of agricultural engineering. The company began developing a new tillage tool, codenamed Project Pearsall. It was a modern interpretation of Arthur's plow, designed to be pulled by smaller, lighter tractors. It was a quiet revolution, a step away from the brute force philosophy, and a step toward a more intelligent, nuanced approach to soil management. The knowledge that had been preserved in a single barn was about to be adopted and spread across the world. The following spring, Arthur's grandson Leo came home from college for the weekend. He found his grandfather not in the barn or the workshop, but walking the West 80. The field was planted to soybeans now, and the young plants were emerging into a perfect, friable seed bed. "It looks good, Grandpa," Leo said, falling into step beside him. "The ground is happy," Arthur replied. He stopped and picked up a handful of soil. It was dark, rich, and crumbly, full of earthworm channels. It was teeming with life. "This is the reward," he said. They walked the length of the field in comfortable silence. The work of the old plow was now an accepted fact, a piece of local history. It was no longer remarkable. It was simply the way things were. The West 80 was no longer a problem child. It was the most productive field on the farm. Richard Sterling, using a prototype of the new John Deere tool based on Arthur's design, was applying the same principles to his own land. The new normal was a quieter, slower, more thoughtful way of farming. As they reached the far end of the field, Arthur stopped. He reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a familiar object. It was his father's small, black, oil-stained notebook. He held it out to Leo. "I want you to have this," he said. Leo looked at the notebook, then at his grandfather. He understood the gravity of the gesture. "Grandpa, I'm studying business. I don't know if I'll be a farmer." "That doesn't matter," Arthur said, pressing the book into his grandson's hand. "This isn't about farming. It's about a way of looking at the world. It's about paying attention. It's about understanding that the oldest solutions are sometimes the best. The principles in this book, they apply to more than just soil." Leo took the notebook. Its worn cover felt warm in his hand. He opened it and saw his great-grandfather's neat, careful script. He was not just holding a book, he was holding a legacy. He was the successor. He had seen the proof. He had heard the story. And now he held the knowledge in his own hands. He looked at his grandfather, and for the first time he fully understood the quiet strength, the deep wisdom that had been there all along. "I'll take care of it," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you will," Arthur said. He turned and looked back at the barn, visible in the distance. Inside, the old red plow sat, cleaned and waiting. It was a symbol, an enduring piece of steel that represented a timeless truth. It was not junk, it was not obsolete, it was a precision instrument, a key that had unlocked the potential of the land. Some things are not meant to be replaced by speed and power. They are built on a different kind of foundation, on patience, observation, and a deep respect for the nature of the thing itself. The hardpan had not been an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be understood. Arthur Pearsall had not invented a new solution. He had simply remembered an old one, and in doing so had reminded everyone that true wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits quietly in the earth for someone to listen.